Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Greg Peterson here, and welcome to the 280th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where 3 days a week we work together educating and inspiring you to become part of your food revolution. Growing plants that thrive in your yard is a lot easier than you think. It starts with saving your own seeds and letting them remember what they already learned. Just text SEEDS to 33444 or visit iwanttosaveseeds.com and you will receive our free webinar on why seeds matter, why saving them is easy, and how to save your own. Today on our podcast, we have someone who is passionate about creatures of all sizes and their role in our food revolution. We're talking to Nancy Lawson about humane gardening. Nancy is a columnist for All Animals magazine, as well as the founder of Humane Gardener, an outreach initiative dedicated to the cultivation and compassion for all creatures, great and small, through animal-friendly, environmentally sensitive landscaping methods. She speaks frequently to local and national audience and volunteers as both a master naturalist and a master gardener in Central Maryland. Nancy is the author of The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife, published by Princeton Architecture Press in April 2017, and highlighted in Oprah Magazine, The Washington Post, and the Library Journal. Welcome to the show today, Nancy.
Thank you. It's great to be on.
So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Yeah, so when I was working at the Humane Society of the U.S. in the early 2000s, late 90s, I was working on a project with some of our wildlife biologists, and it had to do with writing for our magazines about resolving conflicts with geese humanely. And at the time and still now, there were a lot of communities who were really upset with what they perceived to be as overpopulation of geese on their lawns, on the lake fronts, the artificial lakes that are around in a lot of places around here. And so oftentimes the federal government would be called in to cull the geese. And in looking at what some of the solutions were that were actually effective, one of the ones that I found to be the most creative and interesting, and that sort of led me toward the idea of what I called humane landscaping at the time, was the fact that geese actually are attracted to shorelines that are pretty much mowed down. So they're tundra nesters, so they love to nest in lawns and grass because they're mowed and clipped and they can see the water easily and escape from predators quickly.
Oh my God, that is so funny. So our nicely landscaped lawns are attracting them.
Yeah, exactly. And
wow.
So there was a landscape company, that some of the people I was working with worked with, and they were doing these experimental plantings of buffers along the lake fronts of native grasses and bushes. And it really is an effective deterrent. The geese don't want to land there and hang out there and nest there. And so it just made me think about the fact that plants are the answer to so many problems, but we keep mowing them down. And not only is the absence of those plants creating conflicts like this, it's also, on the other hand, not inviting wildlife and making other species more rare. A lot of our native bees, for example, and birds who need native plants for their nutrition and survival. So that sort of got me thinking about why we need to think about our outdoor spaces differently. And at the time, I was gardening a lot, and I was just getting into native plants in the early 2000s too. So the intersection came from there.
So really, what you're doing is you're working in the flow of nature to address the overpopulation of wild animals that we're finding in our cities.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of wildlife are attracted, some of the more common mammals are attracted to these human-built environments, and we've created more habitat for them that way. But It's a tricky issue because, for example, with deer, which many gardeners rail against here, and the solution is often, let's just kill them. They are attracted to these transition edge zones that we make with our lawns. And then they're blamed for coming up and eating the few tulips that you've got. And in my community, we have people with 2 to 5 acre lawns. And most people don't plant that much. And so what they do plant gets eaten. And what we found is that the more that you start to let native grasses come up, these seeds that are dormant in the seed bank, the more that you let native trees start to sucker that they like to eat, like sassafras trees are native here in Maryland, and staghorn sumacs, and they actually like to eat those and nibble on the bark, and they start pruning those. And if you just let an area go like that, even a small one, you're giving them more food, so it takes the pressure off some of your garden plants. And it's not really something that's very explored or talked about because there's always kind of this black and white solution. They're here, there's too many of them, let's get rid of them, instead of let's change the way we look at how we're managing these spaces.
Right. We've started dealing with things like this here in Phoenix. We have, interestingly enough, in the city center area, we've got bobcats, raccoons,
yes,
coyotes, and foxes. And so I've had a long conversation with the rep from the Arizona Game and Fish Department, and removing them doesn't work because what happens is the population just fills back in the space if you remove the ones that are there.
Exactly.
So that's fighting nature again.
Right, exactly. And some animals like coyotes have these mechanisms for reproducing even more when you do that. So so there's other ways to coexist with them and to start to look at our landscapes as it's not just our home. Our homes are very transactional for us these days, where people buy a house and then they want to fix it up for resale in 10 years. And they want to do that with their yard too. And it's very easy to go to a big box center and make it look like everyone else's, the same way you make your living room look like everyone else's, so that everything's just sort of cookie cutter. But it's really bad. We're generalist species, so we can do that. We can find food in so many places and shelter, but a lot of these animals can't do that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Wow. So what do you mean by humane gardening? I have your book here, by the way. I just want to do a shout out for you. It's a beautiful book, The Humane Gardener, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife by Nancy Lawson. And you got beautiful color pictures in here. So number one, tell us about what you mean by humane gardening, and then tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, thanks. So the humane gardening concept is to plant and cultivate in a way that it actually invites wildlife in, but then on the other hand, to also implement methods for preventing conflicts with them. And, you don't want them in your attic, and you need to learn to have that balance. And so there are humane ways to do that, and to do humane exclusion if you're growing a vegetable garden or something like that. But a lot of books out there, and there's a lot of wonderful books about creating wildlife habitat, but a lot of them are sort of selective for butterflies or birds or bees. And some of the more common animals, like we've been talking about, can tend to be vilified, even sometimes among people in native plant circles, because they eat their plants. And then on the other hand, what I had noticed over the years, and what I tried to address in this book too, and the audience I was trying to reach, were sometimes people who are animal welfare advocates on behalf of these maligned animals, mammals generally. They will actually kind of recommend to people, well, if you don't like snakes, get rid of your brush pile. Or some of the other types of advice are like plant deer-resistant plants, which is actually kind of ineffective because they have a rotating palette and they're all different. But also, a lot of lists of deer-resistant plants actually have historically included invasive plants, or plants that are not good for bees and butterflies and the other wildlife, right? So it's just trying to bring that all together to say, don't garden for this species or that species, garden for everybody, including us. And So the book itself is primarily a myth-busting book, and
Nice.
yeah, and I think about it from the what I call the standpoint of the framework of fear. So there's this whole marketing by pesticide companies and nuisance wildlife control companies and others that kind of we get exposed to and we get ingrained in us without even knowing it sometimes, where we start to think of certain really valuable plants as weeds, or we don't even know what plants are actually valuable because anything we didn't plant or find at the big box store is a weed, something that comes up that actually might be the perfect plant for your garden and for wildlife.
Mm-hmm.
And then so we malign the plants, and then we tend to think of them as messy, the leaves as messy, the dead wood, and these other types of habitat elements that are just as important as live plants for wildlife. And then damage to your trees, quote unquote, to your leaves. And it might be a leaf cutter bee cutting out holes to line her nest with little pieces of leaves, making holes in your leaves. Yeah, or it might be a caterpillar who's going to be a butterfly or feed a bird. And then pests and nuisances. So animals like skunks are automatically thought to be bad creatures when actually they can be really helpful in the garden. They can eat things like tomato hornworms for you and grubs, but people fear these animals because they don't understand their cues, and we've sort of lost our understanding of wildlife behavior in some ways. So I address that and talk about everything from skunks to opossums to javelinas and why they behave certain ways and why you don't have to fear them. And then I have in the book at the end of each chapter a profile of somebody in a different region of the country.
Oh, nice.
And so that's meant to show people that these concepts are universal, so it doesn't matter what flora and fauna you have locally. You can do this, and you can do it with different resource levels, and also I tried to choose people who have this sort of whole picture approach, and appreciate anyone who comes into their yard. And lastly, the main thing about what I'm trying to convey in the book and elsewhere is you don't just have to plant, you can also nurture what's already there. And that's why we made the subtitle for that book, Nurturing a Backyard Habitat for Wildlife, because so often we go in and we think, this place is a blank slate and I need to start planting. But sometimes even when it's just lawn, if you just wait a little bit and see what might already be there.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and that's a really cheap way to get great plants too. So that's in a nutshell kind of what it's about. Yeah.
So are you familiar with the term permaculture?
Yes.
Yeah. And have you studied permaculture?
A little bit. I mean, yeah.
So really, it's sounding to me like what you're proposing is, from my viewpoint, permaculture. And I like to say permaculture is the art and science of working in the flow of nature. So really what you're proposing is that we look at our space, which is observed. So we observe our space, and then we jump in and design systems that are in the flow of nature in our fronts and backyards so that it's easier to work with it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's so many, plants for people to eat too that you can come up to when you do this, right?
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, like the stagcorn sumacs I mentioned and the sassafras. I mean, you can make sumac lemonade and things like that, and there's a lot of fruit trees like that I've planted here for wildlife when we first moved in, and for us, like pawpaw trees and persimmons and things like that, with the idea that it's going to be more permanent and it belongs here. These are things that grow well here, and
So I'm sure one of the strategies in your book is to plant natives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not only because of the connection with, which is huge, that I know other guests have talked about on your show, with Doug Tallamy quantifying just how many caterpillars a baby bird needs to be raised.
Oh my gosh, no kidding.
Yeah, and not only that, but also some of the non-native bushes, for example, are not only, as we all know, can be really invasive when they're dropped by birds and such in other natural areas away from your garden, but they can also be really poisonous. And in the South here, it's the cedar waxwings have died from nandina bushes, which are commonly planted in many areas of the country, and they're Asian. And in Pennsylvania this past winter, a mom and her bear cubs died. They were found dead in a church parking lot, and the necropsy showed that it was almost instant death from eating English yew-berries.
Ooh.
And yeah, and those aren't, I don't think that's considered invasive, but that's a berry that they haven't evolved with. And so in England, animals know either if they can eat it or not. And so there's animals there that depend on it, like dormice and squirrels, and I think the satin beauty moth caterpillar eats that plant. But here they wouldn't know that. And so they're hungry in the winter and they're grabbing whatever berries they can find and they die. And that happened out in Idaho with moose and antelope and elk, I think, with Japanese yew-berries this winter over and over again.
Wow.
They found herds. Yeah. And the Idaho DNR asked people, can you stop planting these and can you take them out if you can? And one of the media reports I read, some landscapers were interviewed saying, well, we understand that this is a problem, but it provides winter interest in the landscape, and we make money off it, so we're going to keep planting them.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's kind of up to us, to make that change.
Yeah, take a deep breath, huh?
Yeah.
Wow. So, and I'm sure it's not just all about mammals and flying birds and that kind of stuff. You go into other topics as well?
Yeah, so one of the things that really intrigues me are all the different needs of our nearly 4,000 native bee species in the country.
Right.
And the specialist bees needing the pollen of only certain plants. And so that's a pretty important thing to pay attention to if you're gardening for wildlife, because a lot of our native plants that co-evolved with those bees, and some of them are very tiny bees that you wouldn't even really know it's a bee until you start looking at them more closely. Yeah. So, and they gather, pollen from, there's a violet specialist bee, there's a common evening primrose specialist bee, and there's aster specialist bees, goldenrod. And so, if you're planting a native plant, you're bound to be helping somebody. And so that's...
I love how you said that. You're bound to be helping somebody, not something.
Right.
Nice. We were out on a hike. I was out on a hike with a buddy of mine, Kevin, the other day. And it's, those big black bumblebees?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's bumblebee season here, and they're out in force. And, when we hike, they kind of dive bomb us a little bit. And it's they don't sting. They're harmless.
Were they carpenter bees?
Yeah, the carpenter bees.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're so funny. Yeah.
And people have been trained to just fear them. They're batting at them and ducking away, and it's like they're not going to eat much. Just let them be.
Exactly. I know. And I think that, it makes sense initially that a person's reaction to something is going to be to protect themselves.
Yes.
And we all do that. I mean, I was lying on a float in the pool the other day, and something landed on my lips.
Oh, wow.
And my first reaction was like, oh my God, shaking my head. Well, it was a dragonfly. And I wish I had just opened my mouth and looked, because what a cool perspective that would have been, right?
No kidding.
So, but I think it's important to just kind of face your fears and challenge your assumptions.
Yeah.
Because like you said, I mean, so many times it's just something that you're unfamiliar with, but
right.
Doesn't want anything to do with you, really.
So I'm standing on my back patio, and I'm new to this whole idea of permaculture and humane gardening, and I'm looking at my big backyard. What are 3 things that I can do? What are the first 3 things I'm going to do in the space to kind of start stepping toward, this notion of humanely gardening or really just working with nature? And I'm actually going to say, do a precursor to that and say you can get her book, The Humane Gardener, as well. So that could be number one. So what's 2, 3, and 4?
Okay, so first I would assess what's already there and start noticing what types of animals are visiting. And maybe actually before you even do anything in your yard, look around in other spaces to see if somebody nearby has a wildlife habitat already and take a cue from that. But are you talking about if you're trying to grow a vegetable garden and attract wildlife?
Sure. Yeah, let's go there for starters.
Yeah. So one of the books from Xerces Society, Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. Have you read that one?
I have, and we've had them on our show as well.
Okay. Yeah, they've had several books, and that one has some neat case studies about how much more productive your farm can be, your farm crops, when you have those pollinator patches nearby, because they attract the parasitoid wasps and the predator wasps and other animals that kind of keep the insect balance in check on your And so I would look at what types of plants are native to your area that are going to help attract those types of animals. And then also, I mean, animals need things more than just plants. So if you're talking about you're in Phoenix, if your whole yard is, I know some people still do try to grow grass there, right?
Yeah, we do that here.
And have a lot of gravel and a lot of mulch and things like that. So you're gonna kind of not have as many hospitable places for these ground nesting bees and these other animals that you want to come and help pollinate your plants, because most of them nest in the ground, in twigs, in dead wood. And so I would look at what type of elements that you already have like that, or that you can add, that will harbor some of these creatures, the dead wood bringing the beetles, who then might bring the birds who eat the beetles, and not be tempted to just, yank down a standing dead tree, for example, or something else that might provide a different kind of habitat you may not have thought about yet.
So interestingly, I had one of the big trees on the property here. I have a third of an acre. It's about 14,000 square feet. And I have a large ash tree in the backyard, and about every 5 years I have to do a nice trim on it. And one of the branches that they took off recently had carpenter bees nesting in it.
Oh my gosh!
And so I had them cut the 3-foot length and leave it here on the property.
Oh, and that's awesome!
Yeah, and it's really interesting. It's laying in the shade over in the corner of my yard, and there's this pile of sawdust at both ends where they're continuing to, do what they do, which is break down the wood, and pollinate and do everything they do. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, and that's in permaculture, the first thing we tell people to do is go out and observe your space, and not just your space, but observe the spaces around you, your neighbors. And I've been in Phoenix for 50 years this summer. And I've been gardening for 40 years this summer here in Phoenix, and I still see things when I go out and wander the neighborhoods and pay attention to what's going on. And so after doing this for so many decades, I still see things. So observation is really, really important. Yeah,
it's amazing. And it's really joyful. I mean, the discoveries that you can make are just like with your carpenter bees. It's just, it's amazing to see how animals use every bit of space and ones that you didn't even know were there and had never seen before. And then I'll look it up and it'll be, that's the common whatever dragonfly. It's everywhere. Well, it's new to me, and that's exciting.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, we were talking about the dead wood.
Oh, yes.
And adding that. And I was going to say, I'm glad that you brought up the carpenter bee story, because a lot of times people ask me, well, they're eating my deck, and what should I do? And oftentimes they're not really going to do much damage. If they are, you can plug it or whatever. But I'd rather tell them, leave the dead wood and put some, if you have some, you can put it out there for them, and they might use that instead. So your story is a great example of that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
why is dead wood important in our landscapes? I mean, we already visited one reason, but why else?
Yeah, well, so there's all kinds of creatures, not only, the beetles feeding on it, and they make holes that then cavity nesting bees can use,
Mm,
pileated woodpeckers and other woodpeckers can go use. So they serve as sort of the first in the chain the beetles do to break down that wood for the birds. But then also like fallen logs out here, there's salamanders under there. Lizards and toads get moisture under there, and so the dead wood really also adds nutrients back into the soil as it's breaking down. But there's all kinds of creatures under there and under fallen leaves, like firefly larvae need fallen leaves. They need that
oh,
moisture
yeah.
layer, and so we wouldn't have fireflies here if we just had the lawn because it's too dry for them.
Right.
And so all this organic material is just so important for the whole cycle of life.
Yeah.
And for also, dead tree snags, the cavities there, foxes will nest in there, raccoons,
Mm-hmm.
possums, and animals that people love to love, like bluebirds. And
Right.
yeah.
Right. So in permaculture, we have a zone system, and zone 1 is the area that you go in your yard every day, all the way up to zone 5, which we like to call our wild zones. And
Mm-hmm.
part of what I'm sensing is that we just want to let parts of our yards, parts of the space that we're gardening, just let it go and see what happens. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I'll give you some examples from here. We have 2 acres and it backs up to woods,
Mm-hmm.
and it was pretty much scorched earth in the back, all lawn and a lone forsythia bush. And we kept mowing it for a long time. I was adding gardens, but I was basically doing it not permanently. I was growing annuals from seed and vegetables from seed every year, but not focusing on the trees or
Right.
anything like that. And we started planting some native trees, but it was still scorched earth for a really long time until we tried to let the grass go. And I'm pretty sure that what came up was actually native grasses, but I thought that they were some kind of European hay grass or something. And so we mowed them back down, and then I went to a nursery a few years ago, and I saw a native broom sedge grass. I think it's Andropogon virginicus, and it's one of the first pioneer species to come in here on disturbed land. And I was going to buy it for $15 in a pot. And I ran out of my gift card someone had given me, so I didn't have enough money. I came home, and a couple days later, I was looking at those grasses that we just had neglected to mow for a few weeks, and I was like, this is one of those grasses.
Yeah.
And it turned out we had hundreds of them coming up, and then as we let that stay, then we had purple top grass,
Mm-hmm.
and now we're getting goldenrods and boneset and these other wildflowers, so we're getting the successional situation going on. Now, some places where I've done this, of course, there's invasives coming in. And so I kind of have to identify, well, what is a plant I should leave and what is an invasive? Sometimes they look very similar.
Right.
And I don't use Roundup or any pesticides. And so I have to come up with strategies for
managing them.
Those.
Yeah.
And so I started using some of these really vigorous native plants to ground covers to beat back things like we have garlic mustard, which is invading the forest understory in the east and the north here. And we have Japanese silk grass, which does the same thing. And I noticed one time I had left some pots of a native ground cover, really beautiful, called golden ragwort, out under some trees. And I just forgot about them. I was going to give them to friends. And the next spring, they were rooting out from the bottom and into garlic mustard.
Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing. And And so it's, fighting plants with plants. And so there's all these little strategies of, and there's no one recipe for it. It's just something you start to learn. But like you said, when we were talking earlier, there's a lot of new gardeners who may not know about those things. And so I like to try to give those ideas to people for how to do it. And fortunately now, unlike when you and I started, there's a lot more people can find online, a lot more help they can get really quickly.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Yeah. So sort of piggybacking on what we've been talking about, I did not assess what we had here when we came, and I pulled out a lot of really useful things like milkweed, which of course monarch butterflies depend on, and jewelweed, which hummingbirds love, and I just assumed because they had the word weed in them or because they looked different from the things I was planting,
right,
that they were weeds. And we didn't know to check for little animals before mowing, and my husband had inherited a big kind of, tractor mower from his dad. And we mowed over an eastern box turtle. And I wrote about that in my book and talked about how I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that, because that does happen sometimes where they can be treated at a wildlife rehab center.
Right.
But, this turtle had been obliterated. And turtles, they reproduce really slowly, and it doesn't take much to make a local population go extinct.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, and so that sort of thing is just heartbreaking. It happens all the time, but I've made a lot of mistakes, but those are some that I think are preventable. Even if you have to still mow, if you still need a little grass area for your kids, or you have a huge space and you're slowly trying to convert, there are things you can do, like walk around first and see who's there. And now when we just mow paths through the meadow for the most part, and I walk in front of the mower while my husband's mowing, and I use a stick and I just look for, whoever's there, just to let them know too, okay, if you're a frog, jump out of the way, So, yeah.
Nice. So what do you consider your biggest success?
Well, my biggest success, I'd have to say, it is the book, because what I wanted to do with that, and it seems to be working so far, is to help people look differently at their spaces and think from other species perspectives. And I've heard from a lot of people, I have friends that I've made recently who used to run nature centers and things like that. And they actually didn't know how much life they could support even in a small space of their own yard. And they weren't really focused on that. And now they're really excited to even sort of have made peace with the rabbits and figured out a way to plant for them too, and things like that. So, and when young people respond to this idea of gardening differently, I think that that's really important. And I had someone come to one of my talks who said, I just started gardening last year and I've made so many mistakes. I've completely changed what I'm doing, and I'm telling all my friends. And that I think was the best result. Yeah, because that's the new generation.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. I love getting input from people that are, kind of listening to the seeds that we're planting out there, and it's making a difference for them. Yeah.
Yeah, and because we're so used to being marketed to, and I think there's so many people who care. They just don't know.
Yeah. So what drives you?
So what drives me are both the animals and the people, and seeing every day when I walk out the door something new, making use of a plant or a twig or a fallen leaf, and knowing that it's so easy to actually make a difference and to convert this 40 plus million acres of lawn back to something more productive. And then seeing the people who are actually doing this around the country and is really, really inspiring to me, and interviewing them. And there was a woman I profiled in Florida who just posted today that she finds these amazing discoveries in her yard, and she's done this by letting certain areas go and seeing what comes up over the course of the last 10 years. And she had a picture of a spider eating a tree frog. And,
whoa.
yeah. And she posted it at some point on her blog and got contacted by a scientist because it's really rare, and he was doing a paper on it. And so it just got published. And so she shared, that she's the ultimate citizen scientist and humane gardener in my mind, because she doesn't kill anything, because she knows how valuable everything is to everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that really inspires me.
Nice. So if you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be and why?
Yeah, so the book that I would recommend along these lines is called Wild Neighbors. Wild Neighbors, The Humane Approach to Living with Wildlife. And it's, I believe, out of print, but you can still get used copies. And it is a national book, so it has species profiles and natural histories and methods of conflict prevention and resolution for animals around the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was written by a wildlife biologist I worked with. And he used to work at the National Park Service, and then he worked at the Humane Society, so he had a varied background. And it's just very, very gently written, very beautiful, and also really helpful. It's helped me a lot in my own garden over the years. And then the other book I was going to mention that I just was really influenced by is old now, from 2001. I'm sure you've read it. It's called The Botany of Desire.
My gosh. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. That just changed the way I looked at plants and our relationship with them. So it really had a big impact on me.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary book. So, and I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I want to talk a little bit more about your book, The Humane Gardener.
Okay.
And what I want to ask you is, your publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, can you tell us, because this isn't normally where we get the gardening books at, from this press. So make that connection for me. How did you make that happen? Because that's pretty magical.
Well, that's a good question. Okay, so I was writing a column and I still am, for the magazine of the Humane Society. I don't work there anymore, but I freelance for them. And it was called Humane Backyard at the time, and it was for All Animals magazine. And the editorial director emailed HSUS and said, "Can you tell me how to get in touch with Nancy Lawson, because I wanted to see if she wants to write a book."
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I had never I had considered it, but by the time I got around ready to write a book, I felt like, oh, maybe this has already been done. I'm sure someone's written about it. So that's how that started. And they do some nature books, and they do landscape architecture, but they're mainly a fine art publisher.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
how exciting for you. Congratulations. That's
Thank you.
Yeah. And once again, it is a beautiful book, great pictures. And I don't know, having gardened for 30 plus years really actively, I don't know that I've seen another book near this topic. So yeah, it hadn't already been done.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners? Well,
so I would say, and I've heard you say this on your podcast, that there's no such thing as a black thumb. I think that you can't overemphasize that, because there's so much fear around, am I doing things right? Am I following the recipe of plant these plants 1 foot apart and add this fertilizer? And so I would say trust yourself and trust plants. They know how to grow, and animals need them. Animals need plants as much as we do. And so the more that you can add to your landscape. Don't worry about being a perfectionist.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's where I would start.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Absolutely. So how can our listeners find your book, get a hold of you?
You can find the book on any major retailer, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can usually find it at your library. And you can get a hold of me through my blog at humanegardener.com. There's a contact form. And then I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/humanegardener, and Instagram and Twitter just at Humane Gardener.
Perfect. You can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/Humane Gardener. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Growing plants that thrive in your yard is a lot easier than you think. It starts with saving your own seeds and letting them remember what they already learned. Just text SEEDS to 33444 or visit iwanttosaveseeds.com and you will receive our free webinar on why seeds matter, why saving them is easy, and how to save your own.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.